Last night, someone told your soulmate the truth about you and they couldn't believe it. My beloved child. Last night, your soulmate heard something about you that completely changed the way they were looking at your entire connection. It wasn't a casual compliment. It wasn't gossip. It was a truth about you, something they had never fully understood, something they may have even doubted before. And when those words reached them, they reportedly went quiet. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. The person speaking to them knew something about your journey, your character, or the way you had been carrying yourself in silence that your soulmate never expected anyone else to notice. At first, they questioned it. They asked how this person could possibly know. But then one detail was mentioned that made their heart stop for a moment. Because suddenly, memories of you began connecting in a completely different way. Stay till the end, because the most important part of what they heard wasn't the first revelation. It was what that revelation forced them to realize about you. Your soulmate may have spent more time thinking about your past than you realize. There were moments when they misunderstood your silence, your distance, or the way you handled certain situations. They may have wondered why you didn't chase harder, why you didn't explain yourself more, or why you sometimes seemed to disappear emotionally when things became difficult. But last night, someone gave them a perspective they had never considered. They were told that what looked like indifference may have actually been self-control. What looked like distance may have been you protecting your heart. And what looked like weakness may have been the strength it took for you to keep going without telling everyone what you were carrying. That realization hit differently because your soulmate suddenly remembered specific moments between you. A conversation. A strange silence. A look in your eyes. A time when you could have reacted but chose not to. Suddenly, those moments weren't confusing anymore. They were clues. And then came the one detail that made them ask, almost immediately, why didn't they ever tell me this? What happened next is the part you need to hear carefully, because your soulmate didn't simply become surprised, they became emotionally unsettled. The truth forced them to question whether they had completely misunderstood you. They began wondering how many times you had been hurting while pretending everything was fine, and how many times you gave them understanding without receiving the same understanding in return. Don't skip this moment, because something huge is waiting for you in what they realized next. According to the person who told them the truth, there was one specific thing about you that your soulmate had never seen clearly before: you weren't asking to be rescued. You were waiting to be understood. And that distinction changed everything. Your soulmate suddenly understood why certain moments between you felt so intense, why your connection never completely disappeared, and why even after trying to move forward, something kept pulling their thoughts back toward you. But there was one final piece of information they heard last night, and this time, they didn't question it. They simply sat there in silence, realizing they may have already made a decision about you without knowing the whole truth. There was a moment after that when your soulmate stopped trying to defend their old assumptions about you. Instead, they started replaying everything. They remembered the times you stayed calm when they expected you to react. They remembered moments when you could have demanded an explanation but simply walked away. And suddenly, those memories carried a completely different meaning. The person speaking to them didn't just tell them that you had been misunderstood, they revealed that someone had been watching your actions from a distance and had noticed something your soulmate overlooked. You had been consistent when nobody was applauding you. You had been caring without demanding recognition. You had been carrying emotions you never placed on someone else's shoulders. That realization unsettled your soulmate because it meant the version of you they had quietly created in their mind wasn't complete. And then they heard one sentence that made them stop completely: you don't know what they gave up just to protect what they felt for you. Your soulmate wanted to know exactly what that meant. They started asking questions. Not casually. Not with curiosity alone. They wanted details. Who knew about this? How long had they known? Why had nobody told them before? And the more they heard, the more emotional the conversation became. They were forced to confront something they may have avoided for a long time. There were moments when you could have exposed your feelings, explained your side, or made things easier for yourself, but you chose silence because you didn't want to create pressure. That silence had been misread. Your restraint had been mistaken for a lack of feeling. And now your soulmate was realizing that the person they thought had moved on may have actually been trying to respect the situation while quietly protecting something deeply meaningful. Don't skip this part, because this is where the truth became personal. The person speaking to your soulmate didn't just describe what you did. They described why you did it, and that explanation touched a place your soulmate had been trying not to acknowledge. Then came the question your soulmate apparently couldn't escape: if they cared that much, why didn't they tell me? And the answer was painfully simple. Sometimes a person can care deeply and still refuse to force their way into someone's life. Sometimes love looks less like chasing and more like stepping back, even when every part of you wants to stay. That realization changed the emotional weight of everything your soulmate remembered about you. They began wondering whether they had been waiting for you to make a move when, in reality, you had already made yours. You simply chose not to cross a boundary. For the first time, they understood that your silence may have been saying something louder than words ever could. And just when they thought they finally understood the truth about you, the person speaking to them revealed one final detail, a detail so unexpected that your soulmate reportedly went completely still. Because it suggested that while they had been trying to figure out whether you still cared, you had already been given a reason to let go, and that is the part they were absolutely not prepared to hear. For a few seconds, your soulmate didn't know what to say. The idea that you might have had a reason to let go hit them harder than anything else they had heard that night. They started asking themselves what could have happened without them knowing. Had you been disappointed by something they said? Had you noticed something they thought they had hidden? Had you reached a point where protecting your peace became more important than waiting for them to understand? The person speaking to them didn't answer immediately. Instead, they reminded your soulmate of something they had probably forgotten: you had been given opportunities to react, but you chose patience. You had reasons to become bitter, but you chose dignity. You had every reason to make your feelings obvious, but you refused to turn your heart into a demand. That was when your soulmate's expression changed. Because suddenly, they weren't thinking about what you had done. They were thinking about what they had failed to notice. And then the conversation became even more revealing. Your soulmate was told that there was a side of you they had never truly seen, the side that quietly notices everything. You may not always speak when something hurts, but that doesn't mean you don't understand what's happening. You remember patterns. You recognize changes in someone's energy. You notice when words and actions don't match. And according to what your soulmate heard, this was one of the reasons you pulled back. You weren't trying to punish them. You were watching to see whether their actions would eventually tell you the truth. That realization made your soulmate uncomfortable because it meant some of the answers they had been searching for were already sitting inside their own memories. They remembered promises that were never completed. Conversations that ended too soon. Moments when you seemed distant for no obvious reason. Suddenly, those moments look different. Don't skip, because what came next was the part that shook them emotionally. They were told that you never stopped caring, you simply stopped proving it. That sentence stayed with your soulmate long after the conversation should have ended. They couldn't stop thinking about what it meant. If you still cared, why had you become so quiet? If you still felt something, why had you stopped reaching out? And if you had truly moved forward, why did the thought of losing you suddenly feel so painful? Your soulmate realized they had been waiting for a sign from you while ignoring the possibility that you had been waiting for one from them. For the first time, they understood that both of you may have been standing on opposite sides of the same silence, each wondering who would finally take the first step. But there was another revelation waiting beneath all of this. The person who told your soulmate the truth wasn't finished. Before leaving, they shared something about your future intentions, something your soulmate had never expected to hear. And when they heard it, their entire attitude changed, because suddenly they realized this story might not be waiting forever. What your soulmate heard next made the room feel strangely quiet. They were told that you had reached a point where you were no longer willing to keep standing still for something that had never given you clarity. Not because your feelings had disappeared, but because you had finally understood that caring about someone doesn't mean abandoning yourself. That realization hit your soulmate with unexpected force. They suddenly remembered every time you gave them space, every time you chose not to pressure them, and every moment when you could have demanded answers but didn't. They had interpreted your patience as endless availability. Now they were realizing it may have been the opposite. Your patience had a limit. And the person speaking to them made one thing very clear. If your soulmate continued waiting for the perfect moment, there was a possibility that the moment would eventually disappear. That was when your soulmate stopped listening casually. They leaned in. They needed to know what you were planning to do next. The answer wasn't what they expected. You weren't planning some dramatic confrontation. You weren't preparing to punish them or make them jealous. You were simply becoming more focused on your own direction. You were learning to stop explaining yourself to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. And that truth affected your soulmate more deeply than any accusation could have. Because suddenly, they understood that your greatest change wasn't becoming colder. It was becoming clearer. The person speaking to them described how you had changed the way you carried yourself, how you had become more selective with your energy, and how you no longer felt the need to prove your heart to anyone. Your soulmate listened carefully, because every detail sounded familiar. They recognized the person being described. It was you. And then they heard something that made their hearts sink. Someone close to you had already noticed this change too. Someone had realized that you were preparing yourself for a new chapter, and your soulmate had no idea how close that chapter might be. That was the moment your soulmate became afraid of something they hadn't allowed themselves to consider before. They might actually lose their chance, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally stopped waiting. Suddenly, the truth they had heard wasn't just about your past. It was about time. They began wondering whether they had waited too long to understand what was right in front of them. They thought about the conversations they never finished, the feelings they never admitted, and the questions they kept postponing. For the first time, uncertainty didn't feel safe anymore. It felt dangerous to the connection they still secretly valued. And just when your soulmate thought the conversation was over, the person who had revealed the truth looked at them and said something that changed the entire direction of the night. There's one more thing you need to know about them. Your soulmate immediately asked what it was. The answer came slowly, and it revealed something about you that could completely change what happens next. The final truth wasn't about something you had done recently. It was about something your soulmate had misunderstood for a very long time. They were told that you had never been as uncertain about your feelings as they assumed. You knew what you felt. What you didn't know was whether acting on those feelings would lead to something real or simply reopen an old wound. That distinction stunned your soulmate. Because it meant your silence wasn't confusion, it was caution. You weren't waiting because you didn't know what you wanted. You were waiting because you wanted to see whether they could meet you with the same honesty you were prepared to offer. Suddenly, every unanswered message, every quiet moment, and every time you stepped back seemed to carry a different meaning. Your soulmate realized they had been searching for proof that you cared while overlooking the fact that you had already shown it in quieter ways. And then the person speaking to them revealed something even more unexpected. You had apparently spoken about your soulmate before, but not in the way they imagined. Your soulmate immediately wanted to know what you had said. The answer caught them off guard. You hadn't spoken with bitterness. You hadn't tried to make yourself look like the victim. You had simply acknowledged that this person mattered to you, while also admitting that you couldn't keep living inside uncertainty. That statement hit your soulmate harder than an angry confession ever could have. Because there was no manipulation in it. No pressure. No attempt to force an outcome. Just honesty. Your soulmate began realizing that you had been protecting their freedom while quietly protecting your own heart at the same time. They wondered how many times they had mistaken your maturity for emotional distance. How many times had they assumed you didn't care simply because you refused to chase? Stay till the end, because the next realization is where everything becomes even more personal. Your soulmate suddenly understood that if they wanted another chance with you, they couldn't approach you with the same hesitation they had carried before. Something about them would have to change first. And that realization created a completely different emotion inside them, urgency. Not panic. Not desperation. A quiet urgency that comes when someone realizes the person they care about may no longer be standing in the same place. They started thinking about what they would say if they saw you again. Would they finally tell you what they had been hiding? Would they admit that they had misunderstood you? Would they explain why they pulled away when they did? The questions kept coming, one after another. But then the person who had told them everything delivered one final warning. If you want to know whether there's still a door open, you need to stop looking at their old behavior and pay attention to what they do next. Your soulmate didn't respond immediately. They just stared ahead, processing every word. Because deep down, they already knew what that meant. You were changing. And the next move might no longer belong to you. By the time the night was over, your soulmate was carrying a completely different picture of you in their mind. The truth they had heard wasn't something they could simply forget when the conversation ended. It followed them into the silence afterward. They kept replaying the words, especially the part about your patience having a limit. They wondered whether you had already reached that limit without telling anyone. And for the first time, they stopped asking, "Does this person still care about me?" Instead, a much harder question appeared: what if I'm the reason they finally stopped waiting? That question stayed with them because they could suddenly see the connection from your side. They realized that you may have spent a long time giving situations the benefit of the doubt, hoping actions would eventually match feelings. But something had shifted. You weren't trying to force an ending. You were simply refusing to remain trapped inside uncertainty. And that difference made your soulmate understand that whatever happened next could not be based on assumptions anymore. Then something unexpected happened. Your soulmate began thinking about the one conversation they had always avoided having with you. Not a casual conversation. Not a message filled with small talk. The real conversation. The one where excuses disappear and both people finally say what they actually feel. They realized that if they approached you, they couldn't hide behind pride or vague words anymore. They would have to acknowledge what they had misunderstood. They would have to admit that someone else had helped them see the truth they had been too close to recognize. And perhaps most importantly, they would have to accept that you might not respond the way they once expected. That possibility frightened them. Because the person they remembered might have waited for reassurance, but the person you are becoming may require consistency. Don't skip this part. The biggest shift wasn't that your soulmate suddenly discovered you cared. They discovered that your love was never the problem. The real problem was whether they were brave enough to meet you with the same honesty. And now, there is one final piece of this story that changes the emotional meaning of everything that happened last night. Your soulmate was told that you are not looking for someone to convince you of your worth anymore. You're looking for someone whose actions make you feel secure without needing constant explanations. That truth landed differently because your soulmate finally understood what they had been given, and what they had risked losing. They may not know exactly what you'll do next, but they know one thing now: the old version of this connection cannot continue. If they want a future with you, they'll have to show up differently. They'll have to speak honestly. They'll have to stop expecting you to carry the emotional weight alone. And somewhere beneath all their uncertainty, a decision was beginning to form. Maybe that's why last night mattered so much. Someone didn't simply tell your soulmate the truth about you. They forced them to see what they had been refusing to see. And now that they know, the next chapter depends on what they choose to do with that truth.